The courtroom was colder than it should have been, not by temperature, but by nature. The tall windows of the Ashbury County Courthouse filtered weak sunlight through their dusty panes, casting long, fractured lines across the worn marble floor. The air carried the scent of aging paper, polished oak, and quiet desperation. A few coughs punctuated the stillness as people shifted unease on hard wooden benches, waiting for the next name to be called. Case number 47821. Daniel Cole. Charges: criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. The clerk's voice was expressionless, but it echoed with finality. A shuffle of papers, a murmured sigh, then silence. Daniel stood slowly, a half-second delay in his left leg betraying an old injury. At 42, he looked older. His face was lean, but not from fitness. His eyes were darkened with exhaustion, an exhaustion that no sleep could cure. His shoulders hunched forward, not in defeat, but as though carrying an invisible pack he could never set down. Across from High, behind the elevated bench, sat Judge Alan Prescott, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, expression carved from stone. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Daniel like he was scanning a file, not a man. The courtroom regular exchanged hushed glances. Prescott was known in legal circles as the gavel, unyielding, unbending, unsympathetic, and especially unimpressed by service records. Next to Daniel stood Emily Tran, a young public defender with earnest eyes and a leather briefcase far too big for her frame. She had been assigned the case just 24 hours ago and had spent the night poring through military discharge forms, psychological evaluations, and sworn testimonies that no one seemed to care about anymore. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Cole pleads not guilty. He is a decorated veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. His actions, while arguably inappropriate, were driven not by mal, but by desperation. He was seeking—" Judge Prescott cut her off with a sigh. "Miss Tran, this court does not award medals for past occupations. Your client disrupted the peace outside a public official's home. The law is not subject to nostalgia or sentimentality." Emily's lips pressed together, but she nodded. This was expected. Daniel hadn't spoken yet. He just stood there, eyes low, hands trembling slightly at his sides. He didn't blame Prescott. He didn't blame Emily. He wasn't even sure he blamed Senator Granger, the man whose sudden reversal on a veteran's healthcare bill had ignited all this. What he did know was that a promise had been broken. Again. And people were still dying for it. "You may speak," Prescott said, flatly, almost bored. Daniel cleared his throat. The room, still and watching, seemed to lean in. "I wasn't trying to scare anyone," he said quietly. "I wasn't threatening. I stood on a sidewalk holding a sign. I didn't yell. I didn't cross the fence. I didn't break anything." He paused, the words catching behind his teeth. "Then they came, slowly, but surely. I just wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why. Why he changed his vote. Why he told us help was coming and then walked away. 22 veterans a day take their own lives. I've buried 4 of my friends in the last 2 years. One of them called me the night before. I told him to hold on, that the bill was coming, that the treatment center was real." Daniel's voice cracked. He blinked, and the tears slipped free anyway. "I'm not standing here for myself. I'm standing here for the ones who didn't make it home, the ones who did but are still dying." A hush fell across the courtroom. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair, arms folded. He exhaled sharply and then laughed. A short, derisive sound. "Mr. Cole, spare us the theatrics. This is a courtroom, not a therapy circle. If you want sympathy, there are parades in November." The gasp was audible. Even the bailiff stiffened. Daniel's face flushed, not from anger, but shame. His hands curled into fists to stop the shaking. The weight of it all, the memories, the guilt, The cold marble beneath his boots threatened to drag him under. Emily stepped forward, face pale. "Your Honor, before sentencing, I'd like to call a character witness for Mr. Cole." Judge Prescott waved his hand dismissively. 5 minutes, not a second more. Emily nodded and moved quickly to the rear doors. She opened them, whispered to someone waiting outside, and returned to Daniel's side. He turned to her, confused. She hadn't told him anyone was coming. The doors opened again. The room shifted. A tall man entered, back straight, uniform immaculate, medals catching the light. He walked with a prosthetic leg, the steel glinting just beneath the hem of his pants. But his steps were steady, his presence commanding. The gallery murmured. Judge Prescott's fingers paused over his pen. Emily spoke clearly. "The defense calls Colonel Marcus Reed." Long before the courtroom and the gavel and the stairs, there had been another kind of silence, one that didn't come from solemnity, but from shock. The kind of silence that followed an explosion. The kind that rang in the ears, vibrated through the bones, and left a mark no medic could stitch shut. April 17th, 2016. Dan Cole had been in the third vehicle of the convoy when the IED detonated. The explosion tore through the lead Humvee like paper. Fire. Screaming. Then nothing. Dust choked the air, and adrenaline turned seconds into something elastic. The lead vehicle was on fire. Inside was Colonel Marcus Reed, his commanding officer, a man who never left his soldiers behind and who expected the same in return. Dan ran. He wasn't supposed to. His leg was already bleeding from shrapnel. But he ran anyway, through smoke, through open fire, over broken metal. He reached the wreck just as flames kissed the undercarriage. He yanked the door open with blistered hands. Reed was unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel. Fuel pooled under the wreckage. Dan didn't think. He lifted the colonel over his shoulders and started walking. 1/2 mile to the extraction point, through enemy territory. With one leg nearly giving out, he didn't stop. The explosion behind him lit up the desert like a second sun. Dan didn't talk about that day. He never had. Not to his parents, not to Emily, not even to Reed, who had thanked him formally. Months later, during a ceremony Dan hadn't even attended. To Dan, it wasn't heroism. It was loyalty, something sacred, something he still believed in, even now, when it felt like the world had stopped believing in it with him. When he got back home, things didn't go back to normal. Not really. The streets were quieter. The food tasted different. People talked about traffic and gas prices and baseball scores, like the world hadn't cracked wide open somewhere else. Dan tried. He really did. He got a job in security, night shifts, fewer people, more silence. He attended his scheduled appointments at the VA, checked all the boxes, answered the therapist's questions as honestly as he could. Sometimes he made it through a week without a flashback. Sometimes he didn't. The worst wasn't the nightmares. It was the guilt. 3 men had died in that convoy. One of them was Eddie Vega, Dan's best friend, a kid from El Paso with a crooked smile and a baby girl he never got to hold. Eddie had asked Dan to write to his wife if anything ever happened. Dan did, but he never mailed it. It didn't feel like enough, so Dan started something small. A weekly meeting at the local library, Veterans Support Circle. It wasn't therapy, and he wasn't a professional, but it was real. No forms, no bureaucracy, just chairs in a circle, coffee in a thermos, and men and women trying to hold on to the thread of themselves. Word spread. They came with stories, scars, and sleepless eyes. One man, a former Marine, showed up drunk the first time and sober the next. A woman who had lost both legs in Iraq shared her poetry. Another man didn't speak for the first 5 meetings, but just listened. When he finally did talk, he said, This is the first place I felt human since I came home. Dan funded it himself out of his disability checks. No one asked for money. No one had to explain why they were there. Then came the vote. Senator Granger had met with Dan and a small group of veterans. He'd shaken hands, promised change, looked them in the eyes. "Help is coming," he said. "We're with you." Dan believed him. He told the group, "This bill's gonna pass. We'll get the center." It would have established the first trauma-focused PTSD treatment facility in their entire region. Dedicated staff, peer integration, crisis support, real beds, not waiting lists. But when the vote came, Granger turned his back. No press release, no explanation, just a quiet no. 3 weeks later, Kevin Mercer, one of the regulars from the circle, took his own life. He left a note. "I thought we had a chance. I was wrong." Dan folded that note and kept it in his wallet, right next to his own DD-214 discharge paper. He carried them both every day. So yes, Dan had gone to the senator's house. He didn't yell. He didn't cross the gate. He stood on public ground, holding a sign that said, "Keep your promise. Veterans are dying." A few neighbors called the police. Granger, pressured by party advisors, pressed charges. It wasn't personal, they said. It was about precedent. But to Dan, it had always been personal. Because the moment a politician breaks a promise to a man who kept his, on fire, under fire, carrying another life on his back, that's not politics. That's betrayal. Back in the courtroom, Dan kept his eyes low as Colonel Reed approached the witness stand. The memories surged behind his ribs like a wave he'd held back for years. He could still feel the weight of Reed's body slumped on his shoulders, the heat from the explosion, the silence after. Dan hadn't saved Reed to be thanked. He'd saved him because that's what you do. That's what they'd all promised. Colonel Marcus Reed took his place at the witness stand, like a soldier returning to formation. Back straight, jaw firm, eyes forward. But something in his gaze softened as he looked at Dan. He hadn't seen him in years, not since that day in the desert. They'd exchanged a few emails, a brief letter, but nothing that could carry the weight of shared fire. Some moments, once survived, became too sacred or too heavy for words. "Please state your name and credentials for the court," Emily said, her voice more composed than she felt. "Colonel Marcus T. Reed, United States Army, retired," he said. "Served 27 years, 2 Silver Stars, 1 Distinguished Service Cross. Currently working as a consultant for veteran reintegration programs nationwide." Judge Prescott didn't look impressed. He kept scribbling in his legal pad, eyes flicking up only occasionally as if checking the time. Emily gestured toward Dan. "Colonel, can you describe your relationship with the defendant, Mr. Cole?" Reed nodded once, sharply. "Dan served under my command for 2 tours in Afghanistan, one of the most dependable men I ever had in my unit." He paused. "On April 17, 2016, our convoy hit an IED. 3 soldiers died instantly. I was in the lead vehicle. It caught fire. I was trapped." The colonel's voice remained steady, but a shadow flickered in it. "Sergeant Cole ran through live fire to reach my vehicle. He pulled me out moments before it exploded. He then carried me, bleeding, unconscious, over half a mile to the extraction point. I lost a leg that day, but I kept my life." There was a silence. Not even the judge's pen dared interrupt. Dan kept his eyes down, his jaw clenched. The images came back whether he invited them or not. The black smoke, the pounding in his ears, the sound of Reed gasping for air as the flames closed in. "He never once brought it up," Reed said, turning to the judge now. "Not once. I've had soldiers do brave things before, but the ones who carry it quietly, they're the ones who still hear the screaming at night." The judge cleared his throat. "Yes, well," he muttered. "That's certainly commendable, Colonel. But what relevance does that bear on a trespassing charge years later?" Reed's jaw tightened. "Context," he said simply. The judge raised an eyebrow. "This is not a court for political grievances, Colonel." "No, Your Honor," Reed replied. "It's a court for justice, and justice without context is just paperwork." He turned to the gallery and nodded to Emily. Emily opened a manila folder and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. "These are letters from veterans Mr. Cole has supported through his peer group," she said. "People who credit him with helping them stay alive." The judge flipped the pages, barely glancing at them. "Yes, well, community service is admirable, I'm sure," he said, placing the folder aside like yesterday's newspaper. "But there's more," Reed said firmly. Emily stepped forward again. "Your Honor, Mr. Cole also volunteered 40 hours a week last winter at the Ashbury VA when it was severely understaffed. He helped process backlogged benefit claims so other veterans could receive the care they were owed." From the back of the courtroom, a voice rose. A woman in her 50s stood. "I work at the VA," she said. "What they're saying is true. He worked overtime for nothing. We cleared a 3-month backlog in 6 weeks because of him." Judge Prescott slammed his gavel. "Sit down. Outbursts will not be tolerated in this courtroom." The woman sat, but her words hovered in the air, like smoke after gunfire. Emily stepped forward again. "The man Mr. Cole protested against. Senator Granger met with him personally and assured him he would vote in favor of the Veterans Trauma Recovery Act. That bill would have funded the only PTSD treatment center in our county." She looked directly at the judge. Granger flipped his vote without explanation. Days later, one of Mr. Cole's group members committed suicide. Judge Prescott shifted in his chair. The gallery, once restless, had grown unnaturally still. "With respect," the judge said, his voice slightly thinner than before, "we are not here to put a senator on trial." "No, we're not," Reed said. "But when you criminalize a man for seeking answers, you're telling every veteran in this country that their pain is an inconvenience, that their loyalty ends where politics begin." He let that hang there. The judge's mouth opened, then closed. Just then, the rear doors creaked open. Dozens of heads turned. A slow, quiet procession entered the courtroom. Veterans of every shape and age. Some walked with canes, others with prosthetics. A few wore faded unit caps or pins. One man rolled himself forward in a wheelchair, his shirt reading, "Veterans Stand Together." They took their seats quietly, filling the back rows like a silent testimony. The judge looked up, startled. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked. "Bailiff, remove these people." The bailiff hesitated. "Your Honor," Emily said quickly, "this is a public courtroom. They are not disrupting proceedings. They are observing." Judge Prescott seemed unsure, his hand hovering over his gavel like a nervous tick. He looked around and for the first time seemed aware of just how many eyes were on him. Eyes that had seen war. Eyes that had buried friends. Eyes that weren't here for theater, but for truth. He cleared his throat. "You have 5 more minutes, Miss Tran," he said curtly. But something in his tone had shifted, slightly. Just enough. Colonel Marcus Reed didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need dramatics. The sheer weight of his presence. The slow, deliberate cadence of his words and the story he carried on his shoulders were more powerful than any outburst could be. He looked down for a moment, gathering something from within, then met Judge Prescott's eyes. "I want to tell you what happened after Sergeant Cole carried me to safety," he said, "because that's not where the story ends." The courtroom leaned in. "They'd airlifted us to Bagram. I don't remember the flight. I don't remember the morphine drip or the surgery that took what was left of my right leg. But I do remember the moment I woke up." Reed's voice caught slightly. He didn't hide it. "I remember opening my eyes and seeing him sitting next to my bed. bandaged, limping, reeking of smoke. He hadn't slept. He hadn't gone through debrief. He hadn't even changed out of his bloody fatigues. He just sat there, making sure I was still breathing. Dan shifted in his seat. Emily glanced at him. He looked away. He didn't do it for rank or medals or recognition. He did it because, in his world, you don't leave anyone behind. Ever. Reed took a breath. When I got back to the States, I heard he was struggling, like many of us do. But unlike most, he didn't retreat into himself. He took his own pain and built something for others. He turned to the gallery now. You've heard about the support group. I've sat in on it, quietly, in the back. I watched veterans come in broken, some of them drunk, some of them so hollowed out by PTSD they could barely make eye contact. Reed nodded toward Dan. He met every one of them where they were. No judgment, just presence, just honesty. A beat. When the VA system fell apart during the winter, he stepped up again. No paycheck, no uniform, just a folding chair and a laptop, helping other veterans get the benefits he'd barely accessed himself. Prescott was no longer scribbling. His hands were folded now, still stiff, but no longer dismissive. Emily rose again, producing a second folder. Your Honor, she said, this contains service records, sign-in logs, and verified letters from dozens of local veterans. These are not opinion pieces. These are facts. The bailiff brought the folder to the bench. Prescott opened it. This time, he didn't toss it aside. As he read, a voice rose again from the back. He got my brother into rehab, a young woman said, her voice soft but steady. I didn't know where else to go. Prescott's gavel came down harder this time. This is not a community meeting. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The formality of the space was bending under the gravity of the people in it. People who had spent their lives taking orders, following rules, keeping their stories quiet. And now they were watching to see if this court would hear them. Colonel Reed wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. I was in the room when Senator Granger told Sergeant Cole and the rest of us that the Veterans Trauma Recovery Act was a priority. I remember his exact words, "We owe you more than thanks." He looked directly at Judge Prescott. Then he voted no. No explanation, no meeting, not even a call. Reed gestured toward Dan. Dan came to me that night, said he felt like he'd lied to his guys, said he looked into the eyes of people barely holding on and told them things would get better, said he wished they'd yelled at him instead of thanking him. Dan was still, eyes on the floor. A small muscle in his cheek twitched. I told him it wasn't his fault, Reed continued, that he'd done everything he could. But it wasn't enough for him. He needed an answer. He needed someone in power to look him in the eye the way he looked at all of us. Reed turned back to the judge. Instead, he got arrested. Prescott's face was unreadable, but his eyes, once cool and calculating, were now focused, fixed. Behind his polished bench, something was cracking. Not loudly, not obviously, but definitely. I understand the law is blind, Reed said, but it should never be deaf. He looked around the room. This man has done more with his pain than most people do with their power. He doesn't ask for pity. He asks for accountability. Then he stopped, and for a long moment, the courtroom remained silent. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed hesitant. Judge Prescott shifted in his seat, as though awakening from a dream he hadn't intended to enter. He looked at the row of veterans seated in the gallery. Some nodded silently. Some sat perfectly still, arms crossed, eyes locked forward. They weren't here to beg. They weren't here to protest. They were here to remind him that justice wasn't theory. It had consequences. You've made your point, Colonel, Prescott said finally, his voice quieter than before. But no one believed that was the end. Because at that moment, the heavy doors opened again. The bailiff turned. A woman wheeled an elderly man into the room. Frail but proud, he wore a dark cap embroidered with a faded emblem. A World War II veteran. Colonel Reed stood. Dan looked up, recognition dawning like sunrise on his face. The judge paled. Emily blinked in surprise, then turned to the woman. "May I ask who this is?" she said. The woman nodded. "This is Major General Walter Prescott, my father." Gasps rose like wind through tall grass. The judge's hand trembled. Dan stood instinctively, straightening despite the pain in his leg. Judge Prescott stared at the man in the wheelchair, his father, his legacy, the man who taught him right from wrong. Only now, that line was being drawn by someone else. Major General Walter Prescott didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His entrance had already ruptured whatever illusion of control Judge Alan Prescott thought he held over the room. His presence settled over the courtroom like a flag being lowered to half-staff, solemn, symbolic, and steeped in things that demanded respect without ever asking for it. The general's voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, a voice long trained to command, but now thinned by time. "Richard," he said, addressing the judge by his first name, "I raised you better than this." You could feel the air suck out of the room. Judge Prescott blinked. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Walter leaned forward in his wheelchair, his hands, spotted and veined, gripped the armrests like they were keeping him upright through sheer will. His eyes, though dulled by age, were sharp enough to cut through his son's defenses. "I fought at Normandy. I've buried men who died younger than you were when you got into law school. And I didn't fight for a country where veterans are mocked in courtrooms." The words dropped like stones. "I didn't fight," he added, "so my own son could sit in judgment of a man whose boots have walked through hell and back." Judge Prescott shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, glanced at the bailiff, then at the door, as if there might be an escape route. But there wasn't. "Father," he began, trying to maintain his composure, "this is highly irregular. I am presiding over a—" "I understand the law," the general cut in, louder now. "I also understand justice, and I know when the law is being used as a shield to avoid empathy." He turned toward Dan, whose posture was straight now, military straight, but whose eyes were wet. "You don't know this, Mr. Cole," the general said, "but I read your file. I asked Emily to send it to me. Your service record, your discharge papers. I even saw the suicide note your friend left behind. I cried when I read it. My son, on the other hand, laughed." The room sat in silence, every breath held like it might shatter something fragile. The judge tried again. "Dad, you don't understand the full context of—" "I understand exactly what this is," the general interrupted, his voice rising in strength. "This isn't about the law. This is about fear. You fear what this man represents, that he did something hard, that he faced something you never had to. A beat. That he made a promise and kept it." The judge lowered his gaze, his gavel forgotten on the bench. The general looked around the courtroom. "I'm old," he said softly. "I've seen America at its worst and at its best. This," he gestured at the quiet rows of veterans behind him, "this is America at its best. People who didn't run from fire. People who came home and kept fighting, not with guns, but with their hearts." He returned his gaze to his son. "Richard, we both know you never served, and I never judged you for that. I didn't raise you to be a soldier. I raised you to be a man who knew right from wrong." The judge opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked at Dan, really looked at him for the first time. What he saw wasn't just a defendant. It was a man carrying a war no one else could see. It was also the man who saved his father's commanding officer. Emily stepped forward gently, sensing the moment. "Your Honor," she said, No one here is asking you to ignore the law. We're asking you to see the full picture, to let your judgment reflect not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice. The judge glanced at the gallery. The veterans in their Veterans Stand Together shirts didn't cheer. They didn't nod. They simply sat, witnesses of a truth that didn't need embellishment. Judge Prescott took a long breath. His hand finally reached for the gavel, but didn't raise it. Not yet. "I need a recess," he said, standing abruptly. 15 minutes. He stepped down from the bench and walked not toward the judge's chambers, but toward the man in the wheelchair, toward his father. They spoke in hushed tones. No one could hear the words, but they didn't need to. Some things didn't require volume. Dan remained seated, still upright, hands folded in front of him. Emily leaned over and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the general. I wasn't sure he'd come." Dan shook his head slowly. "How did you find him?" "I stayed up late," she said, "looked through your file, traced your commanding officer. Then I asked around. The general lives in a veterans' home 2 counties over. When I told him about the case, he insisted." Dan swallowed hard. His voice was barely audible. "Why?" Emily gave a half-smile. "Because you never asked anyone to stand up for you." 15 minutes passed. When Judge Prescott returned, he carried no gavel, no notes, just a different weight, a quieter one, a more human one. He sat, and for the first time, he looked not down, but eye to eye. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "I'd like to hear from you again. Not for the record, not for procedure, just as a man." Dan nodded once and rose. The wooden floor creaked under Dan's boots as he stood. He didn't straighten the way he once might have in uniform. His back no longer carried pride the way it once did. It carried weight, but he stood tall anyway. The courtroom was still. Veterans in the back didn't shift. The general didn't speak. Judge Prescott didn't interrupt. This moment, finally, was Dan's. "You asked why I went to Senator Granger's house," he said. "Why I trespassed. Why I couldn't just send an email or call his office like everyone else." He took a breath. His hands were steady now. "I'll tell you why." He looked directly at the judge. His voice was quiet, but every syllable was anchored with meaning. "When I was 24, I made a promise. In a ditch in Kandahar, with bullets flying and people screaming, I made a promise to a dying man." He looked around the courtroom, but his mind was somewhere else. "I promised him I'd make sure the ones who came home wouldn't be forgotten, that I'd look out for them, that I'd fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves." Dan's voice didn't tremble anymore. It rang with something deeper. "For years, I did that in silence. I held hands in VA waiting rooms. I sat next to men detoxing in borrowed church basements. I spent nights on the phone with people I've never met just to keep them alive till morning." He paused. Then that bill came. The Veterans Trauma Recovery Act. It was the first real chance we had. A chance at something more than group meetings and generic meds and being told to stay strong. A chance at healing. Dan took a step forward, not toward the judge, but toward the invisible weight between them. When Senator Granger told us he'd vote for it, I believed him. And I told my guys, some of them barely hanging on, that help was coming. Another pause. Then he changed his vote. No warning, no explanation, just gone. Dan looked at his hands. 3 weeks later, Kevin Mercer shot himself. He was 29, served 2 tours, came to every one of our meetings, told me that if the bill passed, he'd finally check himself into a facility, that he just needed to know someone cared enough to build something for people like him. Dan looked up again, and this time, Judge Prescott didn't look away. I couldn't give him that. Silence. The courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. I didn't go to Senator Granger's house to threaten him. I didn't yell. I didn't carry a weapon. I stood on public ground and held a sign that said, "Keep your promise. Veterans are dying." Dan exhaled. Because they are. The judge sat motionless. He had heard thousands of testimonies, hundreds of defenses, scores of confessions, but none like this. None where the words weighed more than the law itself. After a long moment, Prescott spoke, but not from the bench, not from authority, just as a man. You could have gone through other channels. You knew it was illegal to demonstrate outside a private residence. Dan nodded. I did, and I accept that. Then why? Dan's voice softened. Because I needed him to see me. I needed him to see us. Not numbers, not cases, not statistics. Just men and women who did what we were asked to do, and are asking for help, not pity. Help. Major General Walter Prescott watched his son carefully. He'd seen this look before, on young officers about to order an assault, on medics losing soldiers they couldn't save. It was the look of someone being forced to confront a truth they'd been trained to ignore. Alan Prescott turned slightly in his chair. For the first time in his career, the courtroom did not feel like his domain. It felt like a place where something ancient and moral had awakened and was now watching him. He looked at his father. I didn't serve, he said quietly. Walter nodded. I know. I spent most of my life trying not to be swallowed by your shadow. Walter's eyes softened. I never asked you to follow me. I only asked you to be worthy of the country I fought for. Alan turned back to Dee. You are right, he said. Justice without humanity is hollow. He stood slowly. This court will recess briefly. I need time to review everything and reflect. Before leaving the bench, he looked at Dan again. Thank you for your service, Sergeant. This time, the words didn't sound like a cliché. In the hallway outside, as people began to file out, Dan remained in the courtroom. He sat beside Emily, neither speaking for a moment. You okay? She asked gently. I think so, he said. That was the first time I've said all that out loud. Emily nodded. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for all of them. She gestured to the gallery, where the veterans still sat, quiet but now less burdened. Dan looked over at the general, who was still seated, eyes closed. I never thought I'd see a general come to court for me, Dan said. You didn't see a general, Emily replied. You saw a father. Dan's expression softened. He looked toward the judge's bench. Now empty. Now empty. Do you think he'll change? He asked. Emily was quiet for a moment. I think he already is. When the court reconvened 30 minutes later, the mood had changed entirely. The room was no longer merely a setting for procedure. It had become something deeper, a space charged with the weight of truth, raw and unfiltered. There were no cameras, no press conferences, no grand speeches, only people, and pain, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the law could also be merciful. Judge Alan Prescott returned to the bench with no robe on. He carried a folder and a legal pad, but his most striking accessory was a new expression, one no one had seen before: humility. He cleared his throat softly. This court is back in session. Dan stood, flanked by Emily. Behind them, the courtroom was still full. The veterans hadn't left. Prescott looked out at them, then at Dan. I've read the letters. I've reviewed the volunteer records. I've listened to the testimony of Colonel Reed and Major General Walter Prescott. And most importantly, he paused, I've listened to you, Mr. Cole. Dan didn't respond. He simply nodded, eyes steady. I will not sugarcoat this. The law is clear. Trespassing on private residential property, even a sidewalk bordering a private home, is a misdemeanor offense. You technically broke the law. A few murmurs stirred in the back. Prescott raised a hand calmly. But, he continued. The court also holds discretionary power in sentencing when mitigating circumstances are strong and clearly documented. And in this case, they are not only strong, they are overwhelming. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Cole, your actions that day were not reckless. They were rooted in conscience, not in defiance. You did not threaten. You did not harm. You simply stood and asked to be seen. Dan's jaw clenched, not from anger, but from the sheer force of emotion rushing to the surface. Therefore, Prescott said, this court finds you guilty of misdemeanor trespassing, as the law demands. But in sentencing, he exhaled, you are hereby sentenced to 6 months probation. No jail time, no fines. You will complete 100 hours of community service, to be fulfilled by continuing and expanding your peer-led veteran support group. The silence broke, not with cheers, but with a breath, an almost collective release of tension, like air returning to a deflated lung. Prescott raised a hand again. This court also formally recognizes that support group as a court-approved community rehabilitation program. Veterans referred by the local criminal justice system for minor offenses related to PTSD or readjustment challenges may, at this court's discretion, be directed to your group as part of alternative sentencing. Emily's eyebrows rose. Dan blinked, stunned. I'm not finished, Prescott added. He turned slightly toward the gallery. As of this morning, I have arranged a personal donation of $10,000 to seed a fund dedicated to the Veterans Support Circle. I will be reaching out to other judges, local officials, and private donors to contribute as well. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Colonel Reed sat straighter. Prescott wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, this court strongly encourages Senator Granger to meet with Mr. Cole and designated veteran representatives to reopen discussions regarding the proposed treatment center. He looked directly at the reporter seated discreetly in the corner. You are welcome to quote that. The young journalist nodded, already scribbling furiously. Finally, Prescott looked back to Dan. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back those you've lost. But I can do better moving forward, and I will. A beat. This court stands adjourned. He raised the gavel. And for the first time that day, when it struck wood, it didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like progress. Outside the courtroom, a quiet crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast. Texts, social media, phone calls from people inside. Veterans, family members, even strangers had come to stand in quiet witness. Some held small American flags. Others held each other. Dan exited with Emily and Colonel Reed at his side. The crowd parted gently. No one cheered. No one clapped. But some saluted. Some simply nodded. Eyes filled with the kind of knowing that only comes from living the same kind of pain. Walter Prescott was wheeled out behind them, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his cap now sitting squarely on his head. As Dan reached the courthouse steps, a young man stepped forward, a kid, maybe 22, barely out of basic training. Staff Sergeant Cole, he said, his voice shaking. Dan stopped. The kid extended his hand. Just wanted to say, thank you, for fighting when no one else would. Dan didn't shake it. He pulled the young man into a hug. You're not alone, he whispered. Then he turned to the crowd. None of you are. Later that night, Dan sat on the steps of the support group's temporary space, a dusty church basement they'd been borrowing for over a year. He watched as veterans walked in, some limping, some laughing, some just looking for a place to sit without being judged. Emily joined him. She handed him a stack of envelopes, messages of thanks, offers of help, donations. He opened the top one. It was from Judge Prescott. Inside was a simple handwritten note. I'm still learning, but I'm listening. Thank you for teaching me. Dan folded the note and tucked it into his coat pocket, beside the worn suicide note he still carried. He looked out across the parking lot, where the last of the sun was fading. And for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't scare him. 6 months later, the ribbon at the Ashbury Veterans Trauma Recovery Center was navy blue, not red. That had been Dan's only request. "Red's for ceremonies," he'd said. "Blue is what they really fight through, every damn day." The sun was bright that morning, one of those crisp, clean sky autumn days that made people talk about gratitude and second chances. The smell of freshly cut lumber still lingered in the air, the building behind them a patchwork of modern design and warm earth tones, built for recovery, not bureaucracy. Dan stood at the entrance, scissors in hand, flanked by Colonel Marcus Reed and Senator Thomas Granger. Yes, the same man who once pressed charges. Public pressure, and more importantly, public shame, had changed him, or at least changed his position. Granger had reintroduced the bill 3 weeks after Dan's court case went public. This time, it passed, with amendments, and with a spotlight no politician could afford to ignore. Now, here they stood. Granger smiled tightly for the cameras, holding the edge of the ribbon. But Dan wasn't looking at him. His eyes scanned the crowd. Faces he knew, some he didn't. Veterans, their families, doctors, therapists, lawyers. A few local news reporters. Some held signs, some held hands. All held something heavier. Hope. Dan cut the ribbon. It fell to the ground like a curtain drawn back, revealing the future. Inside, the center felt different from any VA clinic Dan had ever stepped into. No flickering fluorescence, no plastic chairs arranged like a DMV. Just light, real light. Big windows, bookshelves, art made by veterans, quiet rooms with doors that didn't slam, coffee that didn't taste like regret, and people, trained, trauma-informed, present. Colonel Reed had moved to Ashbury to serve as director. The man had fought wars, lost a leg, survived flames, and now, here he was, reviewing grant proposals and interviewing clinicians. Dan liked to joke he'd finally outranked the colonel in paperwork. Reed would just laugh and say, "You outranked me in heart a long time ago." Emily was there too, of course. She hadn't stopped volunteering. When they needed legal assistance navigating benefits, or when a vet got caught up in minor infractions tied to PTSD, Emily was the first call. She always answered. Judge Prescott never made a speech that day, but he came, sat quietly in the front row beside his father, Major General Walter Prescott, now frailer, wrapped in a wool coat despite the sun. When Dan spotted them, he gave a subtle nod. The judge nodded back. No robe, no bench, just another citizen trying to atone. What changed? A lot. Not everything. The nightmares still came sometimes. Dan still startled when doors slammed, still carried that folded suicide note in his pocket, still ran his fingers over the calluses on his palms when memories came flooding back. But the hands no longer trembled, and the community, his community, was no longer a scattered collection of ghosts. The center hosted weekly peer-led circles, run by Dan and a team of volunteers. There were now licensed trauma therapists, social workers, crisis beds, and reintegration programs that helped veterans find housing, employment, and peace. It wasn't a miracle. It was structure born of suffering. And it worked. A young woman named Elena, who had once attempted suicide twice after Iraq, now worked as a peer counselor. She opened every session with poetry she wrote on the back of old military forms. A former Marine, Theo, who had spent 3 months living in his car, now worked in the center's kitchen and ran a side hustle fixing old radios for fellow vets. There were setbacks, of course. There were days when someone didn't show up, when someone relapsed, when the shadows got too loud. But now no one faced those shadows alone. The Veterans Support Circle, the program Dan had started in a church basement, now had 3 satellite branches across the state. It became a model for alternative sentencing in veteran-related cases. Judges began referring nonviolent offenders to treatment and peer support rather than jail. A new idea had taken root: healing over punishment. Funding came in steadily, not from the government, but from people, everyday citizens moved by the courtroom story, by the bravery of one trembling man who stood in defiance, not with anger, but with grief and purpose. Over $300,000 had been raised by the end of that 6th month, and Dan, he refused to take a salary. "This place saved me before it even existed," he told Reed one night. Instead, he worked, every day, not out of duty, but choice. On the evening of the ribbon cutting, after the crowds had left and the lights had dimmed, Dan walked alone through the halls of the center. He passed the reflection wall, where veterans could pin photos, poems, dog tags, or letters. He paused there, gently touching a folded piece of paper behind glass, Kevin Mercer's note. Dan didn't read it. He didn't need to. He already carried it with him, Al. He turned and looked out the window. A single star had pierced the twilight sky. He wasn't healed, but he wasn't broken either. That night, long after the ribbon was cut and the parking lot had emptied, Dan sat alone on a bench outside the new center. The building behind him glowed softly in the dark, its warm light pouring from tall windows like a beacon. Not grand, just steady, like a lighthouse for the lost. He watched as a moth danced near the porch lamp, its wings fluttering silently. Somewhere in the distance, a train rolled by, low, constant, like a heartbeat too far to touch. He breathed in the cool night air. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like armor. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. He hesitated only a second, then answered. "Yeah, this is Dan." Silence. Then a voice, low, cracking. Someone gave me this number. Said you talk to vets sometimes." Dan's tone changed instantly, his voice becoming a steady rope tossed across a chasm. "You served?" he asked. "Yeah, Afghanistan. Came back 2 years ago. I've been, I don't know, just someone said you'd get it." Dan stood, walked slowly into the darkness, the phone pressed to his ear. "I do," he said gently. "Trust me, I do." The caller's breathing was uneven. "I keep thinking about how tired I am. I'm not sleeping. I don't talk to my family anymore. And sometimes I think, if I just disappear, no one will notice." Dan closed his eyes. "I'd notice," he said. The caller went quiet again. "I've been where you are," Dan continued. "And not just me. There's a whole group of us waiting for you. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to say. Just show up. We'll sit with you, even in the silence." A pause. "You really think it gets better?" Dan looked back at the center, the building built from pain, now sheltering healing. "I think it gets different," he replied. "And then it starts to feel possible." The caller didn't respond, but Dan could feel the weight lifting, just slightly. He offered directions, meeting times, even his personal cell. "Tomorrow?" the caller asked. "If I came by, would you be there?" "I'm always here," Dan said. "We'll leave the light on." He hung up, sat back down, and stared at the sky. Some nights, he still dreamed of fire, of blood, of silence so loud it cracked open the mind. But those nights came less often now, and when they did, he knew he wasn't alone. Emily had told him once, months ago, that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was showing up anyway. He didn't believe her at the time. Now he did. The next morning, Dan arrived early at the center. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, rearranged chairs, and placed a small folded blanket over the coldest seat, just in case. The first to arrive was Elena, humming under her breath. her service dog padding behind her. Then Theo, carrying his usual box of donuts and a joke about caffeine being the real battlefield fuel. Others trickled in, greeting each other with handshakes, slaps on the back, tired smiles. Then the door opened. The young man from the night before stepped in, shoulders hunched, face pale, eyes darting like he might bolt at any moment. Dan stood and walked over. He didn't shake his hand. He hugged him. "Welcome home," he said. Weeks passed, then months. The caller, Caleb, kept coming, spoke a little more each time, laughed once, cried once. On his third visit, he stayed after the meeting and helped stack chairs. Dan walked him out to his car. Caleb looked down at his hands. "You think I'm going to be okay?" he asked. Dan didn't lie. "I think some days will still be hard, but I know this, you won't face them alone." Caleb nodded. "You ever get tired of showing up for all of us?" Dan looked out toward the trees beyond the parking lot, where the sun was starting to slip behind the hills. "No," he said, "because someone once showed up for me." A year to the day after his court hearing, Dan stood again, this time in front of a full auditorium at a national veterans conference in Washington, D.C. Judge Alan Prescott introduced him. Yes, introduced him. The man who once dismissed his tears now called him a model for what justice becomes when it remembers its purpose. Dan took the stage. No suit, just slacks, a black shirt, and his old dog tags hanging loose around his neck. He told the story, not just of the courtroom, but of the people who stepped in when it counted. Emily, Reed, Walter Prescott, the veterans who filled the benches that day in silent solidarity. He ended with a single sentence. Sometimes justice wears a robe, and sometimes it wears combat boots, but it always starts with someone willing to stand when everyone else sits. The audience rose as one. That night, back at the center, Dan sat in his office. There were still files to review, budgets to plan, another intake scheduled for the morning. He'd sleep in the back room again, too tired to drive home, too wired to rest. But he smiled. He checked his phone, no missed calls, and yet, somehow, he still felt like someone had reached out. He whispered to the empty room, "You're not alone." The stars outside blinked gently, like beacons in formation. And across invisible bridges, built of shared pain and quiet courage, one more veteran was finding his way home.
This audio is made with Audio Toolkit for Windows Store, downloaded for free now.